Hi, I'm Jim Huling, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to this episode of Execution Insights. This week, I want to tell you a story about a senior executive that I know quite well. I've been coaching for a long time, but this week, he came to our session visibly unsettled. In fact, he began by saying, "Hey, Jim, I think I handled something really badly last week, and I'm probably going to need some advice on how to fix it." And as it turned out, he had issued a clear directive to one of his managers. And it was something that he thought was straightforward, but it was also urgent. And he was giving it to him just before he left for vacation. Now, my client wanted to know when he returned how the task had gone. And he learned right away that that particular task had not been done. So instead of a better approach, he took the approach of getting really frustrated. And in fact, he called the manager into his office and he very harshly questioned his commitment and his trustworthiness and his accountability. And he said, in essence, "You've really let me down." And all this time, the manager just sat there quietly listening. But when the executive finally paused, the manager gave an unexpected explanation. He said, "I didn't follow the directive because as I began to execute it, I realized it would cause a serious ripple effect. In fact, it would have forced the other departments to redo 2 months of work. So I took a step back and I met with both teams. And you know what? Together, we found a better solution. In fact, we think it's one that will save the company time and resources. And from the first week in operation, it looks like those results are going to be better than the original plan. I was just waiting for you to get back so that I could share all of this with you and also show you how exciting these early results are." Well, I'm sure you can imagine at this moment, there was a very long pause in the conversation. And in fact, my client said that in that silence, he felt the entire weight of what had just happened. Not just the mistake he'd made, which was awful, but he also missed the opportunity to honor the thoughtful initiative of this great person who carried this to a successful conclusion. So my client, looked through the Zoom screen and said to me, "Jim, I missed the chance to truly understand before I reacted." And that phrase became the starting point for all the coaching we did that day. In fact, we spent a couple of hours exploring how quickly pressure can close a leader's field of vision and how empathy is not a soft response. Empathy is the discipline of understanding before judging. And my client later summed this up by saying, in a single rule, never react before you understand. In fact, here's a great part of the story. He even had those words engraved on a small desk plate that faces him, not the other person, so that all day long he's reminded to remember what he learned on this day. Now, when he told me that story, it really struck me, how easily that moment can happen to any of us. It's happened to me. I'll bet it's happened to you. Times when pressure rises, time seems to shrink, and we react before we really understand. It's a human thing to do. But I want to tell you, it's also a fork in the road where leadership either narrows or expands. Because empathy, and what I mean is understanding something from the perspective of the other person, is not about being soft. It's about seeing the whole picture before you make the next move. And when you have that lens, I think there are three truths that keep showing up in my coaching that I want to share in this podcast today. The first one is that empathy widens the field of vision. Now, pressure is the opposite. Pressure narrows focus. But when we zoom in on what's late or wrong or has a mistake, our empathy can widen the frame so that we also see the pressures and the trade-offs and the intentions of the people who work for us. It's a context that changes how you lead. Now, don't get me wrong, it doesn't excuse poor performance, but it explains it. And with a wider view, your performance can improve, and so can your people. You can hold a high bar and a high relationship at the same time. The second thing I've learned is that empathy protects the person from the problem. You know, when you have empathy, you address the miss without crushing the motivation. You can keep your standards very high and you can keep your trust intact, because leaders who do this don't lose authority. They gain credibility. In fact, people on the team learn really fast. Hey, when things go sideways here, I'll be heard before I'm judged. And the payoff of that reputation is bigger than culture. Better context leads to better decision. And the third thing I've learned, which is probably the best, empathy builds better judgment. Do you see, empathy is strategic intelligence. And when you pause to understand, you surface hidden risks. You see blind spots you might have missed. You hear unspoken truth. And what you really hear is meaning, not just words. That's why the message, never react before you understand, now sits on his desk plate facing him so that the reminder meets him before he makes his next move. So if you like the note of the story and you resonate with how this message is going, I want to offer you one last thought, which is, how do you turn empathy from a concept into a practice? And the short answer is, you start with better questions. You start with the kind of questions that open space instead of closing it. Now, here are three that I want to give you that are ones that I use almost every single week, and they always seem to be effective. First, open the space. Say something like, hey, before we jump in to what's on your plate, tell me what's going on that I might not be seeing. Help me see our team through your eyes. Now, this question signals to the person on your team that you really do care. And empathy always begins like this, with safety. Second, here's another question. Reflect on what you hear. So say something like, hey, here's what I'm hearing. Did I get that right? And remember, keep it short, 1 or 2 sentences at the most. Because when people feel understood the way they do when you repeat back something, well, they stop defending and they start collaborating. And third and last, move forward together. Say something like, hey, given this picture, what's the smallest move we could make that would have the biggest difference? You see, this question turns empathy into action, and it keeps the connection and the progress at the same time. I hope you'll remember this. Empathy doesn't mean ending soft. It means ending aligned. And when you ask these kinds of questions often enough, people stop feeling like it's a technique and they start feeling like you are a great leader. You see, if empathy is the discipline of understanding before judging, then this week is your chance to practice where it matters most. So, 3 places you can begin. 1 conversation. Choose 1 meeting or 1 one-on-one where you'd normally start with giving directions, and instead start with understanding, right? 1 reflection. At the end of each day, take a minute to note where you reacted instead of understanding and where you can get better tomorrow. When you do that, you'll start to see patterns and you'll start to make progress. And last of all, 1 reminder. Write the words, never react before you understand, and put them somewhere where you'll see them often, on a note card or on a lock screen on your phone, or maybe even on a small desk plate like my client did. Each of these moments becomes a small act of leadership maturity, and it's a pause that transforms reactions into wisdom. So my hope for you and for myself and for everybody involved in leadership is that before this week is over, you'll face a moment when pressure rises and frustration tries to take control. And in that moment, remember this: the people around you don't need perfection, but they do need perspective, especially from you. They need a leader who listens first and reacts second, and especially one who seeks to understand what's really happening beneath the surface. As a final message I offer to you, empathy is not softness. Empathy is strength. And the kinds of results we've talked about today, well, those are the fruits of empathy at work. I hope you've enjoyed this podcast today, and I'll see you in the next episode. I'm Jim Huling, and this is Execution Insight.